what I want to talk about today is that many listening might not realize that many of the biblical passages that this common view of the end times is based on are actually the very passages pointed to by skeptics as the basis for their rejection of Christianity. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read a few brief quotes for you so we can kind of establish this as being the case. Is that all right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm going to start with is R.C. Sproul. I don't know, I'm sure that you've read The Last Days According to Jesus. It was really instrumental for me. And he wrote, "It would not be an overstatement to suggest that the chief ground for the radical criticism of modern biblical scholarship, which has resulted in a wholesale attack on the trustworthiness of Scripture, is the thesis that the Gospel's record of Jesus' predictions contain glaring errors and gross inaccuracies." Now, as examples of this, we can look at Bertrand Russell and his Why I Am Not a Christian, which I think he wrote in 1927. He said it's quite clear that Jesus believed that his second coming would happen during the lifetime of many then living. In that respect, clearly he was not so wise as some other people have been, and he was certainly not superlatively wise. Albert Schweitzer, he wrote in his autobiography that Jesus really announced the immediate appearance of the celestial Son of Man, and his announcement was shown by subsequent events to be wrong. Bart Ehrman wrote that Jesus didn't encourage people to pursue fulfilling careers, make a good living, and work for a just society for the long haul. For him, there wasn't going to be a long haul. The end of the world as we know it was already at hand. And on the website Jews for Judaism, Gerald Siegel, I think it might be how you pronounce his name.
I think it's Siegel.
Siegel? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's Gerald Siegel.
Yeah. He writes that no amount of Christian theological acrobatics will ever solve the problems engendered by the historical reality that a promised imminent fulfillment made 2,000 years ago did not occur as expected by the New Testament. Now, we're going to dive into this deeply in a moment, but first, is there any truth to what these and other skeptics are saying? I mean, summarize for us what Jesus and his followers said that leads so many people today to reject Jesus as a false prophet.
Sure, but I want to add one thing to what you just said.
Sure.
I mean, that verse almost... Of course, now I have to preface this with my Calvinistic belief, but I felt like it almost caused me to lose my faith. It really put me through a very dark night of the soul, I guess, as you would say. And there's a lot of testimonies of people, like if you go to the forum xchristian.net, that was one of they call it, quote unquote Bible contradictions that they just couldn't resolve. Now I forgot your I forgot your question.
Well, yeah.
Oh, and also remember the other famous quote, C.S. Lewis says Matthew 24:34 is the most embarrassing verse in the Bible.
Oh, wow.
That's a pretty strong statement. So let's start with that one. That's the main verse that people will cite if they're just doing a little, short summation of proving that Jesus was allegedly wrong in predicting his second coming. Is after, predicting all these things that most people believe are in the future, he topped it off with, most assuredly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And I'm not a big fan of saying, well, it's obvious from looking at something that's, what it means, because sometimes there's context and things to take into consideration. But I mean, any fair reading of it would have to say at first blush that really does look like Jesus is saying that everything he just talked about was going to happen before, people that were then living, his contemporaries, all died off.
Yeah, and it's not alone, right? I mean, can you give some other examples that might lead to people thinking that Jesus predicted his coming in the first century?
Well, you got Matthew 16, I believe it's 28, where he says there are some standing here today that will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And, that's right there. If you compare Matthew 16, and it's actually 27 through 28, to Luke 21 verses 31 through 32, which is the parallel to Matthew 34, the Luke
24.
passage... 24? Yeah, okay, sorry. So the Luke passage says, so you also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Well, that's almost a direct parallel to that Matthew 16 passage, which talks about when the kingdom of God will be seen.
Right.
So whatever was being talked about in Matthew 34, Luke is the parallel passage to that, and then you add in Matthew 16, and to me, the combination of verses tells us exactly, the time frame that Matthew's referring to. If people don't think this generation is clear enough, I really would hope that there are some standing here who will not taste death is clear enough, unless they think, there's some people trotting around still, from 2,000 years ago.
Right. Yeah, and I think that what we're going to see here in a minute is that, even these 2 or 3 passages we've looked at aren't alone. But what I want to do is take just a closer look for a few minutes and see if maybe you and I are being a little bit too insistent that the plain reading is what we think it is. So, for example, let's look at Matthew 24:34 a little more closely. He says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Now, it seems to me that there are 3 common ways in which many Christians, not you or I, have tried to defend Jesus' status as a prophet from attacks stemming from this passage. And the first is that some will say that this generation is actually more properly a reference to that generation, speaking of a generation that remains in our future. So, for example, Thomas Ice says, "Our position is that this generation is not the generation to whom Christ is speaking, but the generation to whom the signs will become evident." And then his cohort, if you want to use that word, Tim LaHaye, he writes, "This is a reference to the future generation that will live to see all the signs listed in the previous verses fulfilled in their lifetime." Now, what do you make of this? Do you think that this is a legitimate way to understand Jesus' words?
Well, maybe in isolation, it seems like it could be, but not taking the whole passage in context.
Okay.
And also, it just seems kind of strange that they believe that the Great Tribulation, depending on which of these guys you're going to talk about, you either have 7-year period of time or 3.5-year period of time. I mean, that's significantly less than a generation. It just seems like an odd thing for Jesus to say, to stretch something out to 40 years. That's when it happens, it's going to happen like within a few years, less than 10. So I just find that odd. But putting that aside, Jesus says, the generation will not die till all these things take place. Okay, well, one of the things that was prophesied has already happened. It happened in the 1st century. It can't happen again. By definition, it's unrepeatable.
Okay.
It's not one of those vague things that could happen multiple times. He was referring to the temple being destroyed, the temple that then existed, the temple that the stones the disciples pointed to, and Jesus responded saying, "These very stones, there won't be one left upon another." If the dispensationalists are really going to take the passage seriously, the new temple has to be built of the same stones. I mean, where do you, if you really look closely at the passage, Jesus is very specific. There's not one stone left here that will not be left standing upon another. And, so, I mean, there's so many ways you can go at this. So if you realize that one of the things predicted was the destruction of the temple then standing, can't be repeated, either all of the other things happened back then within that generation, it seems like Ice agrees of the time period of a generation, or Jesus was a false prophet. So I do not think, when you look at the whole passage of everything that was prophesied, that his argument holds water. I do think in isolation it could. I think that although it may seem to us that if Jesus was referring to a future generation, he should have said that generation. I think maybe that's being a little pedantic. Yeah, maybe, but, we could probably point to some other passages where, skeptics would say, well, he should have said this. I mean, I'm not going to quibble over that.
Sure.
So if you take a look at the whole passage, you got a lot of things that can be repeated. There's always going to be earthquakes. There's always going to be wars, there's always going to be false teachers. But the one thing that can only happen once already happened.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And that actually probably might apply to this next attempt that some people make, which is that generation here means race. Schofield wrote that the Jewish race will be preserved, a promise wonderfully fulfilled to this day. And James Burton Kaufman, commenting on this verse, he wrote that as regards the final judgment, generation referred to the descendants of Abraham, meaning the race of the Jews, and that they would not cease as a separate people until the end of time. So how about this? Could this generation be better translated this race?
I don't believe so. And most of dispensational scholarship has moved away from that position. You won't really see the luminaries, of that point of view saying that. Most of them will take the position that Tommy Ice did. But the Greek word, and I know I'm probably mispronouncing it and I don't care, is genia. that's generation. The Greek word for race is, genos, right.
Yeah.
So it's two completely different words. And I have a habit of collecting Bible difficulty books. In dealing with skeptics and sorts of things, I just like them. I find it interesting, especially the older ones. But one that's very popular nowadays is by Gleason Archer called the Encyclopedia Bible Difficulties. And it was one of the things that when I was exploring this issue that I went to see how Matthew 24:34 could be interpreted. And he goes through the ones that you hear from other people, but then he says something I haven't heard anybody else say. And I'm going to read the paragraph only because it's so important.
Sure.
And it only recently struck me how bad this is. He said, perhaps it should be added that if the Olivet Discourse was delivered in Aramaic, as it probably was, then we cannot be certain that the meaning of this prediction hinged entirely on the Greek word used to translate it. Genia and genos are, after all, closely related words from the same root. The Aramaic term that Jesus himself probably used, and then he goes in here, the Syriac Peshitta uses, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, which can mean either generation or race, is susceptible to either interpretation and thus could mean race. Now, the implication of what he said is, if you're a person who believes in the inerrancy and infallibility of Scripture, I know there's slight differences between those two views, but we're speaking generally here. We believe that it's inerrant in the autographs. Well, his view would lead to the fact that God couldn't inspire the correct Greek word to be used. Actually, the inspiration is going to be you would need to know what Jesus said in Aramaic.
Yeah.
And that's just really, really bad, especially when there was a perfectly good Greek word to use, which was genos.
Yeah.
Rather than, going to a language that maybe it was equivocal. In Greek, there was a perfectly good word. And I just think the implications of that are terrible.
Yeah.
Because if he said this in Aramaic, what else did he say in Aramaic? What else is wrong? So even the autographs aren't, infallible? Bad Gleason Archer.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Now, in isolation, Genia can mean race, but it does not make any sense in this context. First, dispensationalists believe that the Jewish race will never pass away. But what Jesus is saying is there's something that will pass away after all these things take place. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. The Jewish race, according to them, is going to live forever. They have separate promises. So that doesn't help at all in making a time frame to point to something that's going to last forever, that'll still be lasting forever before all these things take place. That makes absolutely zero sense.
Yeah.
But Jesus started out this discourse in Matthew 23, I believe it's verse 36, with almost the exact same wording where he just, totally excoriated the Pharisees, and he even told to them, for instance, being left desolate. It's what prompted the disciples' questions in the first place. And he says to them that all these things will come upon this generation. So that this generation in Matthew 23, to me, it goes beyond credulity to say it's a different generation than Matthew 24. Those two are the bookends of this prophecy. So if you transplant that meaning of race back into Matthew 23, you're making the Jewish race of all time guilty for crimes that happened in the first century, such as the crucifixion of Christ. And that was a very bad point of view that led to Christian atrocities against Jews. Not that they did it from the dispensational point of view, but, there were people who had severe anti-Semitism that were blaming their Jewish neighbors for the death of Christ.
Sure.
But that's the logical outcome if you're going to say that this generation in this context here means race.
Yeah. I will point out, though, that it's not entirely absent from dispensational proponents. I mean, the guy that you debated on Unbelievable, if I recall, actually said that the word could mean race here. So, there are at least a few stragglers, who continue to hold out to this as the proper understanding of the word.
With all due respect to Pastor Boyle, I think he was a bit out of his specialty. Yeah. And he even said that, he's more into pastoral counseling. and life issues, and he's never had anyone come to him wanting to know about eschatology.
Yeah.
And, I can respect that. So I really don't think that, he's really studied this a lot. It's not where God has called him to. I'm not, insulting his intelligence or anything like that. You asked me a question on something I haven't studied. I'm just gonna, throw out things that maybe I've heard that I haven't really analyzed in great depth.
Yeah, sure. No, I understand that. Now there is one third view, one that seems really awkward to me, so I'm not so sure that I'll be able to do it justice. But then again, I'm biased. Is, as R.C. Sproul explained it, it's a view which sees Jesus' words as referring not to a frame of time, but to a frame of mind. I don't know if you know what I'm getting at, but, he quotes Herman Ritterboss, I think might be how you pronounce his name, who wrote that we must not attribute a temporal meaning to the words this generation, but must conceive of it in the unfavorable sense in which it occurs also elsewhere, vis-a-vis the people of this particular disposition and frame of mind who are averse to Jesus and his words. What do you think about this approach? Does this do justice to Jesus' words?
No. Again, if he's coming from a dispensationalist point of view, again, if you're talking about people of a certain disposition and he's premillennialist, they still believe there is evil in premillennial, so people of that disposition won't pass away at that time. So again, the same criticism I have of race, would apply here. But I debated somebody long ago in the past, Tony Warren, and the way he explained it was it's kind instead of race. So this kind of people will not pass away till all these things take place. But premillennialism, but now Tony Warren, is an amillennialist, so he can get around that one difficulty. And going back to Matthew 23, again, the criticisms I put against race again apply. Jesus was condemning their specific people for specific crimes, and it's not all the unregenerate that were guilty of those specific crimes. They might be guilty of other crimes,
sure,
but I don't think we can blame our unsaved next door neighbor for crucifying Christ.
Right.
And for saying we have no king but Caesar. So it just doesn't do justice to say, well, there's going to be this kind of people. Plus, it's also like, I love using this expression, it's like wherever you go, there you are. The passage is talking about evil people doing evil things, so Jesus says there'll still be evil people around when this thing takes place. Benny Hinn could get that right.
Yeah, I agree. Well, so, we could say a lot more about this passage, but I want to look at a few others. You mentioned Matthew 16 and 28, where Jesus says, "For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now, the implications, I think, are pretty clear, but some have tried to save Jesus' reputation from the skeptics by saying that he was promising contemporary glimpses or manifestations of his kingdom. So, for example, William Lane sees the Mount of Transfiguration as one example fulfilling this prediction, writing, "The Transfiguration was a momentary but real and witnessed manifestation of Jesus' sovereign power, which pointed beyond itself to the parousia when he will come with power and glory." On the other hand, there are people like Kaufman, whom I quoted before, who sees the promise fulfilled at Pentecost. He says the kingdom did appear on the day of Pentecost during the lives of some of Jesus' disciples, just as Jesus had said. Do you think that the attempts made by the likes of Lane and Kaufman are successful in vindicating Christ?
I wouldn't have too much of a problem with what Kaufman said, because the manifestation of the kingdom did begin then, and it's continuing to now. I wouldn't have too much. I wouldn't say that was the complete fulfillment of it, but I wouldn't have a problem with that. But if he's isolating it to just there and not growing from there, might have to take some issue. But Craig's.
No, sorry, that's not William Lane Craig, it's William Lane.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's right.
Because I know William Lane Craig just did a whole thing on that I gotta get to, dealing with. That's on my list of things to do. Okay, but so Craig's, position that it was just pointing to the transfiguration, which happened a few days later, which was a glimpse of the future kingdom. Again, I could pretty much say, a group of people standing around me probably aren't going to be dead in a couple days.
Right.
Jesus was talking about an event that was far enough away that some of the people listening to him would be dead, but not so far away that everyone would be dead.
Sure.
So, and also, I don't see how Craig's interpretation deals with the part about, Jesus meting out judgment.
Yeah.
That was also something that the people who were standing there, were going to see at the same time as this, big manifestation of, God's kingdom.
Well, sure. And I think that both those points that you just made could be leveled against Kaufman's understanding as well. I don't see the Jews facing a lot of judgment at and following Pentecost. And furthermore, Pentecost was not that much longer, right, after Jesus made this promise than the Mount of Transfiguration was. So I still don't think that Kaufman's understanding really does all that much justice to the text.
If he limits it to Pentecost, you're correct.
Right.
But if he wants to make a starting point there actually was the beginning of the judgment on the first century Jews that happened soon after Pentecost. That's when I believe the 70 weeks ended, when Paul is sent to the Gentiles and the primary focus,
Fair enough.
It turns to the Gentiles. So it's because Jesus predicted that the kingdom, will be taken of you and given to a nation worthy, of its fruits, or, I'm paraphrasing. So I do think that the judgment started to start there and culminated in AD 70. I think part of the problem today is we think very linearly, and I don't think that mindset is demonstrated in the Bible. So you can't take a look at our position like AD 70 is this big black line, down the calendar of history, and everything happened there. I think that 40-year period of time is actually the event. Yeah. It's not something that happened at 5:15 on August 21st, whatever it was, of AD 70.
Right.
It's a block of time. It's that generation.
Yeah.
It's a generational block of time. So that's why I really don't have too much of a problem with Pentecost.
Sure. Unless it's left it's
right.
Yeah, exactly. If it's Pentecost only.
Right.
Yeah. Well, now there are plenty of other ones that we could look at, but there are just a couple more that I want to in the short time that we have today. They're the ones that I think are actually some of the most challenging, not as much so as the two we've looked at, but more challenging than others. And they're in Revelation. Now I know that Matthew tends to be more of your focus than I think Revelation does. I don't see you write a lot on Revelation, but I'm sure that you're familiar with statements like Revelation 3:11, where Jesus says, "I am coming quickly," or in verse 6 of chapter 22, where his messenger says that Jesus sent him to show John the things which must soon take place. And we see, Jesus saying in verses 7, 12, and 20 of chapter 22 that I'm coming quickly. This is all over the place. And it's no wonder then that in the very first verse of the book, John writes that God showed him the things which must soon take place. And then 2 verses later says the time is near. So now I've seen Christians try and vindicate Jesus and John by explaining these texts in two ways. First, in a response to a book written by Hank Hanegraaff, which you and I have read, Mark Hitchcock and Thomas Ice explain what they call the imminency view. So they write, it seems best to understand the timing terms in Revelation in relation to the prophetic viewpoint of the author, and not as necessarily meaning that the events had to occur within a few years of the time Revelation was written. Since no man knows God's time schedule, the time of fulfillment is always at hand. These events are near in that they are the next events on God's prophetic calendar. So, do you think that the time is near could merely mean it can happen at any time?
Well, for a dispensationalist, that isn't the next thing on God's prophetic calendar. There's still things he needs to do with the Jewish people. But no, I mean, the dispensationalist makes it impossible for God to ever say anything was near and mean it. I mean, what words could he have possibly used?
Right.
Because according to them, none of them mean that.
Yeah.
And he says it in so many different ways. It's not just one verse. I mean, I think God went out of his way. He pretty much exhausted the Greek language and trying to make it clear. Plus, something I've always found particularly powerful in Revelation at the end, John's told not to seal up the words of this book because the time is near.
Yep.
Again, a paraphrase. And a lot of people will see parallels between Daniel and Revelation, which I do. But Daniel is told, to seal up the words of the prophecy because the time wasn't near. It was for many days in the future, how, it was put. And Daniel was prophesying of the first, Christ's birth and, things like that, the time of the Messiah. And that was, depending on when you date Daniel, what 600 years was considered not soon at all.
Right.
That you had to seal it up. Now we're going 2,000 years. I would think at least it'd need to be less than 600 if you're going to be consistent.
Yeah, I agree. It seems unlikely to me that Daniel could be told that it's a long way out, speaking of 2,600 years or so, whereas John is told that it's very near, speaking of a mere 2,000 years. I mean, the difference is so minuscule that to think that one could be told it's near and the other far just seems ridiculous.
And the wording is anybody well-versed back then in the Old Testament, which being an oral culture, those people really were, much more so than we are today. Hearing those words would immediately bring to mind Daniel.
Yes.
It's not like us who sometimes have to, get out our, Thompson, cross-reference thing and go and find all the other verses which are similar. They had scripture memorized, not a couple of verses, they had like whole books. So that would immediately come to mind with that.
Yeah.
So I find that pretty conclusive in combination with all the other time statements in Revelation, especially the one where he threatens the church that he'll come quickly if they don't, straighten their act out. I mean, was he really threatening to destroy the whole earth if that one particular church didn't get its act together?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, and actually I've got a question kind of along those lines a little bit later, but let me talk about the second way that I've seen people try to answer this nearness language in Revelation. Some claim that the word that's used to say, where Jesus says he's coming quickly, really is being used to mean suddenly. So again, I'm going to quote Kaufman. He says that quickly can mean soon, but it may also mean suddenly or unexpectedly. And I've seen a number of Christians argue this way. Now, do you think that they might be right? Could it be that those events foretold in Revelation were merely promised to happen suddenly in a short period of time, without respect to how soon they would take place after they were originally foretold?
Well, again, for dispensationalists, there is going to be things that happen, such as the rapture, that would make it not suddenly, unexpectedly, because right there, everyone would know something's up. It's the rapture that's supposed to be unexpected. And we're not really talking about the rapture here in Revelation. We're talking about Great Tribulation. There's a little disconnect there, but that one word is the only word used. As I said, God went out of his way to use different phrases and different expressions to make the point clear.
Yeah. Well,
so, and also, the Bible translators, even though I think some, we all have problems with some translations, but it's so consistently rendered the way it is. And I just don't think there was some big preterist conspiracy, to translate it in this embarrassing way.
Yeah.
I think the mountain of evidence, each thing in isolation, that's reasonable. I think it'd be pretty, pig-headed for me to say it wasn't. But you gotta take the cumulative case.
Right. And we've only looked at a portion of the case. And I'll also point out that the word quickly there can mean suddenly in the way that they've suggested, but where it's used that way in the New Testament, it still refers to something that was about to happen. So I would argue that it's always used to refer to something that happens very shortly after it was originally said. But anyway.
Yeah, even if it has the meaning of quick, of suddenly or unexpectedly, it still carries the time baggage of soon.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Well, so okay, we've looked at two passages from Matthew, and the sentiment is often repeated in Revelation, and we could point to a whole bunch of others, which I'll include in my show notes, so listeners can look it up and make sure that we're not smoking crack or something. But I think that it is clear that much of what we think remains to be fulfilled in our future was originally promised to happen very soon after the promises were originally made. So I guess the point that I'm getting at is that it does sound like Russell and Ehrman and some of the other skeptics we've looked at have good reason to be skeptical, at least, of Jesus, given what we typically understand those promises to refer to. But obviously, I think it's obvious anyway, you and I recognize the force of these time texts, but we don't think Jesus was a false prophet. So the question I have for you is, if not, why not? You're the host of the Preterist podcast. So what is preterism, and how do we preterists affirm the straightforward meaning of the time text that we've looked at, while simultaneously affirming Jesus' divinity and the truth of what he promised?
Well, preterism means, well, the word preterite is it's a grammatical term that means the past tense. And studying foreign language, you'll learn preterite tense and things like that, but it means past. So as opposed to a futurist, which obviously means future. So it means that certain events that some Christians think are past, you're a preterist, and certain events that if you think they're future, you're a futurist. So a preterist is someone who generally, and now there's variations, and we'll get into that a little bit more because there's one variation that's not Christian.
Right, I'm going to bring that up.
Yeah, but I'm talking about people that, affirm the essentials of the Christian faith, which I'm sure we're going to get into. So, there's some people who will take just a preterist view of Matthew 24, talking about the Great Tribulation, and says that happened in the first century, but they don't take a preterist view of the book of Revelation, which I don't understand. But some people maybe will take more of an idealist or historicist view of the book of Revelation. I don't know anybody who takes a consistent preterist view of Matthew 24 and takes a fully futurist view of Revelation. The two, that would be incompatible. But preterism at times is very compatible with taking other passages in more of an idealist and historicist sense. I do that. I think those points of view have some merit, and their lines are blurred a little bit between those particular views. So if we don't think Jesus was a false prophet, and we're saying, yep, what he said was going to happen back then, so what's going on? What are we saying? What we're saying is Matthew 24 isn't about the second coming. Most Christians think it is, but we say it's not. And once you assert and establish that it's not about the second coming, then the skeptics' criticism fails, because they say that the second coming was predicted to happen in the first century.
Right.
And I agree with them that something was predicted to happen in the first century in that verse, but it wasn't the second coming.
Yeah. Well, so for example, a lot of people think that Matthew 24 is not just talking about Jesus' second coming, but the end of the world. Whereas you and I would say that Christ's prophecies were primarily concerned with the end of something else. What would you say that was? Well,
in one way, it depends on how you're going to define world. The word there that's translated world is Greek word aeon. Am I correct? Yeah, I believe so. Yes, aeon, which can mean age. And it most usually means age. And there are some Bible translations which translate it as age. It's not referring to the absolute destruction of the universe. The way it's used in other passages just doesn't lead to that. So it's very reasonable to translate that differently than, that is the end of the world. And in the context, Jesus just talked about the destruction of the temple. That prompted the disciples questions. How do they and they ask, when is the end of the age? If they all of a sudden asked about the end of the entire world, I mean, whoa, slow down that horse. See, how do you get from Jesus saying the temple's going to be destroyed and you go, oh no, the whole world's going to,
Right.
It just doesn't make any sense. They'd be hysterical. So obviously they were talking about the world that they knew, the Jewish system, the way that God was dealing with things, and with the rules and regulations and the temple and all of that was going to be gone. So in one sense, it was their world.
Yeah.
You could use the expression, what are you, in your own world? When you're all, looking off into space or something. We even use it that way today. A lot of time, I'd say more than half the time we use the word world, we don't mean the whole globe or the whole universe.
Yeah, I think you're right. So what we think Christ was concerned with was not, at least in this passage, the end of the whole world, but the end of an age in which God centered on Israel and the Mosaic system of worship and service. Is that kind of about right?
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, now let's talk about coming. Some might be surprised to hear you say we don't believe that this passage is talking about his second coming, despite the fact that he says, I will come in the glory of my angels, and what have you. So his followers were promised that he would come in multiple ways, we think, not exclusively in the sense of his second advent. Can you elaborate? I mean, in what other senses do you think that Jesus promised he would come?
Well, we have that one verse in Revelation, which, it'd be ridiculous to interpret it as the second coming. So church is misbehaving. Jesus says, I'm going to come to you and you're not going to be around anymore. That church will not exist anymore. So obviously he's talking about judging a local congregation. He's not talking about blowing up the universe. The Holy Spirit comes to us. Again, that's not, a physical coming. It's a spiritual coming. But generally, if you go back to the Old Testament, and again, like I said before, when Jesus uses certain phraseology with the disciples, their thoughts are going to immediately go back to similar words and similar context in the Old Testament. And the Old Testament constantly talks about the coming of God as just, it's not, God physically coming down to earth. It's the judgment of God upon a particular nation. Now, then all of a sudden it makes sense. Jesus talked about the temple being destroyed. What's that? That's God judging the Jewish nation, which he's done before. The temple's been destroyed before. And those sorts of things have been described as coming in the Old Testament. So then all of a sudden the disciples' question makes sense.
Right.
When will all these things take place? When's the time of your coming? It's when's the time of your judgment?
Yeah. Well, so this kind of highlights another difference between, our preterism and, any brand of futurism, which is that the judgment pronounced here, it was not judgment upon all of mankind, but judgment upon first century, apostate Israel. They would be judged for murdering the Messiah, since he came to them and without justification they rejected him. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. And then
and to do away with that Old Testament economy.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And then, as far as the other senses in which he would come, you and I are also, familiar with Daniel's vision in which Christ comes. And it's a passage that Jesus, I think, quotes in the Olivet Discourse. But what is the coming before the Ancient of Days that Daniel is talking about there? Is that a coming to earth?
Well, it can't be because Daniel saw, one like the Son of Man coming up to the Ancient of Days. So it's an upward movement. It's not a downward movement. So Jesus is a little bit confused. Maybe he needs some directions because he's going the wrong way.
So would we say that what Jesus was saying, much of what Jesus was prophesying was that they would see the evidence of his having come before the Ancient of Days in heaven? Right. Yeah.
And being given, because that was the vindication of this, the way he was saying, when he said to the Samaritan woman, the time is coming when you won't worship, God here on this mountain or at the temple. There was going to be a new move of God. And, as long as the temple was still there, that was kind of, nanny nanny boo boo, that ain't happening. We're still going to the temple. So it was the demonstration that he was who he said he was. He said he was going to judge the temple, and he said it was going to be within that generation, and it was within that generation. And this may offend some people. I don't mean it in an offensive way. I don't believe Judaism, I'm not saying there aren't Jewish people, but Judaism, the religion, because Judaism's kind of, it's different from most things because there's an ethnic sense to it. And I'm not one of those people who don't think that there's ethnic Jews anymore. Absolutely, I think there are still ethnic Jews. But the way God established the religion of Judaism ceased to exist to AD 70. What's called Judaism today is an invention of man. It's rabbinic Judaism, and I don't believe it's biblical at all, and I don't think it's really Judaism at all. So that's what AD 70 did. Yeah. It completely severed the new covenant and from what was the old covenant.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, so interestingly, whereas skeptics point toward these prophecies as evidence that he was a false prophet, if you and I are right, Jesus ends up being shown to actually have been a very accurate prophet, one accurate to the utmost degree.
That passage to me is amazing once you understand it that way. And there's a book that I think you've read and I've read where it's entitled "The Destruction of Jerusalem," as divine proof that Christianity is true. something to that effect. You'll probably put it in your show notes. I can get you the exact title. It's a tiny little booklet, and it is powerful. It's in public domain. It was written, I think, in the 1800s. And it was a book, actually, I think that was geared more towards Jewish evangelism. And it's just, I think, a very effective book that just shows how eerily accurate Jesus was.
Yeah, this was no Nostradamus.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was very specific, and I often, I mean, there have been many times where I've pointed, either, doubting Christians or outright unbelievers to these prophecies as, evidence that he was, a true prophet. And in fact, as you've pointed out in your podcast, because of how accurate it is, many skeptics have said that it was written in, to the original record after the events actually took place. I don't see any evidence of that.
Skeptics can't have it both ways, though.
Right.
They can't have, they can't say that Jesus said his second coming, that verse is talking about his second coming, and then have Christians write it back in, because then it means Christians were making Jesus a false prophet, and that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It either means the destruction of the temple, or it means the second coming. And if it means the destruction of the temple, and that the Christians wrote it in later, then okay, maybe the passage wouldn't be proof of Christianity, but then you can't use it as a biblical contradiction anymore.
Yeah.
Because it didn't mean the second coming, because Christians, they might think that they like to write things into scripture, but I don't think they were like just so stupid they were going to write a false prophecy into scripture. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, I agree. Well, now, one thing that might be sort of dancing around in some of our listeners' minds, is the nature or the words that Jesus uses, in the events that he foretells. One particular of our view is that we view end times prophecy as foretelling actual events, but by means of symbols or metaphors. Jesus said the sun would be darkened and the stars would fall from the sky. John in Revelation speaks of great earthquakes and the sky being unraveled like a scroll, mountains and islands violently being moved out of place, and fire and hail and blood and all this kind of stuff. Many object to our approach to prophecy on the grounds that it spiritualizes them away. Thomas Ice, for example, we've referred to him before. I have a book in which he debates Kenneth Gentry in a book called The Great Tribulation, Past or Future. And one of the objections that he makes to Gentry's presentation is that he writes, preterists resort to massive doses of symbolic interpretation in their attempt to give these a first century fulfillment. The futurist does not need to make such adjustments and continues a plain reading of the text. Preterists have to interject symbolism at key points without a textual basis. Now, I'm kind of, being a little bit mocking, and maybe I shouldn't be, but, ICE isn't alone. I mean, I've seen Christians who are not preterists, as well as non-Christian skeptics, criticize preterism because of this. So I guess the question I have for you is it true that we really have no textual basis for interpreting end times prophecy in this sort of symbolic way? For one thing, one point to point out is nobody takes the passage quote unquote literally. You're either going to say that the cosmic language is symbolic and the time text is literal, or you're going to really have to do some acrobatics with the time text and make the cosmic things literal. Now, which has biblical justification? Again, we're reading the Bible sometimes, and I think ICE is guilty of that, as if it just dropped out of the sky and hit him in the head in this century. But it didn't. It has a context. It has the Old Testament context and the language of the Old Testament. And that we're not talking about isolated verses. This type of language is throughout the Old Testament. So it would take, the burden of proof is upon him to show that it should mean something different than it meant in literally dozens of ways in the Old Testament, and in a way that makes it consistent with the disciples' question in the first place. The disciples could not be asking about his second coming. They didn't even know he had to go. Never mind, come back. That's a good point that many people don't realize, yeah.
Yeah, there's no reason for them to be asking about a second coming. It's just, we now, looking back and we see everything, we're reading something back into their questions that they could not have intended whatsoever. But I'm going to just do a combination. These are by far not the only verses, but I want to do this combination of verses because this isn't something I've done before, I think, together, but I think it's really interesting. Okay. So, you got Isaiah 19:1. God is prophesying, through his prophet, against Egypt. And the prophet says, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud. Wow, that sounds familiar. And will come into Egypt. He's coming. Wow. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. And if that was in the New Testament, I mean, I would think that, our futurists going to say, that Yahweh saddled up, Gabriel and rode down here on a cloud and started kicking down idols. I mean, that's, if you're going to take it literally.
Yeah.
If you're going to take it the same way you're taking Matthew 24, why not? But it's funny, the cosmic judgment language also goes in reverse. There's cosmic blessing language. Go to Isaiah chapter 60 verses 19 through 20, where God's talking about blessing Israel. He says, the sun shall no longer be your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give light to you, but the Lord will be to you an everlasting light in your glory. So that right there, but here's even better. Isaiah 30 verse 26. Moreover, the light of the moon will be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be sevenfold as the light of 7 days, and the day that the Lord binds up the bruise of the people and heals the stroke of their wound. Do you really think the sun literally going sevenfold would be a good thing?
No, quite the contrary from healing bruises. I think that it would cause quite the sunburn.
Yes. Would SPF 10,000, anyone,
Yeah, right.
So you're seeing it in both directions as blessing and curse. There is no justification. The burden of proof is absolutely on the futurist. And I don't think we should allow them to shift the burden of proof, because we have this already in the Old Testament. And there's multiple passages. I just love when I really understood that blessing one. I was like, oh my God, yeah, what's going on?
Right. Yeah, I agree. And, one of the things that you point out in your podcast that I appreciate is just that we use symbols in the same way in our language. You in one of your podcast episodes, you said that it's the reason why when we hear that, it's raining cats and dogs outside, we take umbrellas and not kennels. A kennel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now imagine someone 2,000 years from now. If, let's say, America got destroyed, like 87, our civilization was destroyed, and they found some of our books, and they saw that expression. I mean, the literalists back then would go, wow, weather conditions were really different back then.
Right.
Animals were falling from the sky.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're doing to the Bible. We have to read it in the idioms of the day. I want to quote something because I just love this, that David Chilton said, even though, David Chilton slid into apostasy, but he was also at the end of an illness. So that's debatable, but his earlier works are very good. And I loved when he said this. He said, the book of Revelation describes a woman clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, and laboring in childbirth while a dragon hovers nearby to devour her child. A radically speculative interpreter might first turn to news of the latest genetic experience to determine whether a woman's size and chemical composition might be altered sufficiently for her to be able to wear the sun. He might also check to see if the Loch Ness Monster has resurfaced recently. I mean, it goes on to say a biblical interpreter, on the other hand, would begin to ask questions. Where in the Bible does this imagery come from? Where does the Bible speak of a woman in labor, and what is the significance of that context? We have to ask questions like that if we're going to understand the Bible as they would understand the Bible.
Yeah. No, I agree. And, I think that we need to be, like you said, I think you hinted at the fact that as preterists, we shouldn't offer this up merely on the defensive. I mean, R.C. Sproul, he writes in his book that this hermeneutic method, where we compare scripture with scripture, is the strength of the preterist position. He says that when faced with the option of interpreting the time frame references literally or interpreting the description of the parousia literally, the preterist chooses the former. And he points out what you've been saying, which is that there is much biblical precedent for interpreting figuratively references to astronomical upheavals and biblical prophecies of catastrophic events. On the other hand, the time frame references are not clothed in such imagery, but are expressed in straightforward, ordinary language. So, yeah, I agree with you. This is a weapon. It's not a shield.
Yeah, we're not the one making excuses.
Yeah.
It's them that are making a radical change. There's something, it's funny that I find things that I can bring into my commentary on my podcast in books that have absolutely nothing to do with eschatology. I'm reading a book right now on divorce and remarriage in the Bible. And the guy, I can't remember the author's name. I'll get it for you for show notes. It's an excellent book, by the way.
Okay.
But he's talking about interpreting Jesus's words and how the people back then would have understood it. And then he brought in some modern examples on how language changes. And he talked about, today, we have the word, mentally disabled or learning challenged when not so far go would have been retarded, which is now considered offensive. And before that, it was the medical term of imbecile. And it wasn't considered insulted. That's just what people with that problem were called.
Right.
Now, during that same period of time, the word gay did not mean what it means today.
Sure.
So he said, if we took a statement from back then that said, isn't it wonderful that almost all imbeciles are gay? And brought it to today, people would be like, slathering at the mouth.
Yeah.
When a person back then would have meant that people that, had some mental deficiencies were generally very happy people.
Yeah.
That's all that would have meant. It would have been a compliment.
Right.
Rather than not something, that was trying to disparage, people of certain orientations.
Sure.
And that happened within a couple generations.
Yeah, we're talking about 2,000 years.
Change can happen fast.
Yeah. Well, so let's shift gears a little bit. The attentive listener might be wondering if preterists like yourself and me understand Jesus' prophecies in the Olivet Discourse and much of the book of Revelation as having been fulfilled in the first century. If we understand many of the promises that he would come as having been promises of a first century coming, just what do we expect is yet to happen? And, before we answer that question, I mentioned earlier that I wanted to postpone asking you how you became so interested and engaged in eschatology, and it was because in doing so, if I recall correctly, you discovered that there are some who profess to be Christians, but who in fact do claim that all end times prophecy was fulfilled in the first century. Tell me about your experience and this view that you discovered.
Well, I started having a lot of problems with Matthew 24:34. I just could not accept the explanations that were given to me. They just didn't ring true. So I started doing a lot of investigation, and the internet was just starting to become, really an information tool. We're talking about 96, around there, 97. And all that was out there that I could find was a view that is hyper-preterism, which is what you just described. And when you really step back and you can take in the logical implications of that view, it is completely devastating to your faith. I nearly lost my faith over it. And I was like, there's no information out here. People just stumble into this unawares as I did. I was fortunate enough to be put in touch with Pastor Corey Soraya. His book, The End of All Things, hadn't come out yet, but he counseled me over the phone. I don't know what I would have done without him. And I was like, there's no information. There has to be other people like me. And from that point on, I just felt that God laid the burden upon me to get that information out there. And for a long time, not that there wasn't a scattered article here or there, obviously, Kenneth Gentry, had some articles, other people had some articles, but there weren't any websites dedicated solely to that sort of thing. And, I think that mine was one of the first. I think it's actually maybe even the first, but one of the first, because you can't possibly know everything that's out there.
Sure.
And fortunately now there's a lot more materials, but I still think it's very, very important. I never would have thought that this would have been my interest, if somebody had told me that. At the time, I was very interested in defending the deity of Christ. That was, Trinitarian apologetics was my forte at that time. And debating with a lot of people from Jews for Judaism who bring up that Matthew 24:34 passage as well. And I couldn't answer them on that.
Right.
So that's how I got into it, from just a personal harm it did to me that gave me then the burden to help other people. I really am not interested in debating hyperpreterists. My burden is for the people that are being led astray by them.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get them before they fall off the cliff.
Right.
Other people can debate hyperpreterists. That doesn't mean I don't post things or say things that refute their point of view. I'm not going to go in the endless circle of debate with them. As I think Kenneth Gentry had just said, I said before that these people need full-time jobs or something, because he said you'll die the death of 1,000 emails the minute you even try And here's an example. I'm not going to say the guy's name because this happens a lot. If he's listening, he'll know who he is. I get on these hyper-preterist mailing lists, okay? I didn't ask to be. They're just doing it to be obnoxious, and I usually ignore it. But this time, I'm trying to clear out my inbox of getting crap. So this was my email. Please remove me from your list. He writes back with challenging. And I said to him, I wrote back and I said, please remove me from your list. But I also said, but if there's some tragedy happening and you're looking for prayer or something like that, feel free to email me. Because I didn't want to be like a jerk. And then he emailed me back and said, my point of view means that I can't pray for them. And I said, I don't know who the elect are. I pray for everybody. But he kept right. And I'm like, and just attack mode and, answer this, answer that. And I'm like, oh my goodness. I mean, that's another thing that actually got me into, combating hyperpredators is Don Preston did that to me. Way back, people remember when you used to be able to, when you bid it on eBay, after the auction was over, the names of the email addresses of all the people who bid were made public. You could see bid what every time. They don't do that anymore. And I was bidding on an eschatology book. Don Preston had a habit of scouring eBay and email. I mean, isn't that really, I mean, it's like OCD much? He emailed everybody who bid on anything related to eschatology promoting his view.
Wow.
And when I asked him to email me, he kept emailing me and pretty much admitted, even if the responses stop emailing me, I'm going to email you back.
Wow.
Even if he couldn't control himself. And this isn't isolated. This happens constantly. And almost anyone involved with this will tell me. If it hasn't started happening to you yet, it will.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous about that, to be honest. I already do have one email I get about once a month inviting me to what I suspect are hyper-preterist conferences and stuff like that. But, yeah.
And you don't ask to be list. They just put you on them.
Yeah, exactly. So, if we don't think that all eschatological prophecies were fulfilled in the first century, like these hyper-preterists you mentioned do, what do we affirm remains to be seen in our future?
Well, the main thing, the big thing, and I think today we underestimate it in the Christian community, is the resurrection. That's really what we're looking forward to. The second coming is tied up with the resurrection. That's why Jesus comes back. He comes back to resurrect.
Yeah.
So that's the biggie. It's the consummation of history. It's the complete and final undoing of what was lost in the fall.
Yeah. And
so that's what we're looking forward to. Yes.
Yeah, well, among other things, but I would agree with you. That would be the biggie, and tell our listeners about what Paul had to say about one contemporary or two contemporaries of his that shared hyperpreterist understanding of the resurrection.
Yeah, there were a couple of guys, Hymenaeus and Philetus. I don't know who would name their babies that. I just can't. But Paul says about them, to warning a church about them, saying that they teach that the resurrection is already past and overthrow the faith of some, and he describes them as a gangrene and a cancer. And I don't think that language has really changed. I really don't think those two terms have ever been complementary. So he really went after them in very strong terms. So this is, there's nothing new under the sun, as Solomon says. This heresy, I'm sure it had different, little, differences here, differences there. But the main thing, the thing that Paul picked out to condemn, the saying that the resurrection has already passed, it's on that exact point that they have in common with today's hyperpreterists. It doesn't matter that some other things may be different. The point that Paul chose to pick out is the exact point that is their big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, is it just in the New Testament? Well, is it just in the Bible that the resurrection is spoken of as being so important, or do we find it in the history of the church as well?
Oh, it always was in the early church, it was huge. I mean, this isn't a debate or an issue that has just started to be studied. It was one of the first things. There's a lot of writings on the futuricity of the resurrection, the physicality of the resurrection, the necessity to believe that as part and parcel of the Christian faith. And though, I think actually Glenn Peoples wrote on this on his blog recently, where he doesn't agree with the strong wording of the Athanasian Creed. It at least shows, though, that how important it was that the physicalness of the resurrection was explicitly put into that creed, in which it says you can't be a Christian if you don't believe this. Right. Now, Glenn thought it went too far in some other areas, but that's just a historical example and what I see in that, which is even more important, is the Athanasian Creed isn't an eschatological creed, it's a Christological creed. And reading that statement about the resurrection in there shows that the authors of that creed saw the nature and timing of the resurrection to be bundled with Christology. And I agree with them. Yeah. I don't think the resurrection is an eschatological issue, it's a Christological issue, and that's why it makes it a salvational issue. And Paul even makes it with Hymenaeus and Philetus, and even in 1 Corinthians 15, you had some people there saying, the dead can't rise. Yeah. That's ridiculous, because that's, the Greek thought then. They didn't have a problem with disembodied spirits or things like that, but people in the ground, no, they don't rise. And Paul showed them that if you don't believe that can happen, you're still dead in your sins, because Christ couldn't have risen, and our resurrection is going to be like his.
Yeah. Well, so then as preterists, you and I affirm all the, eschatological or Christological fundamentals of the Christian faith, like the bodily return of Christ, the bodily resurrection of the dead, and then I'll throw in there as well the final judgment, the consummation of creation, and a physical existence for all eternity. But what does this say about those who claim that all of this has already been fulfilled? Do they hold to a view which Christians should consider to be just one among many legitimate views in the Christian community?
Yeah, that's what they're trying to do. And because of that is what's kept my involvement so, where I've kept on this for like a decade now, is they consistently are trying to, sneak their view in under the radar. Almost, and I compare it to the way, there's been the whitewashing of Mormonism recently. Yeah. At one time, the Mormons were very clear that they thought everyone else was, apostate jerks. But now they're trying to be, we're Christian, just like you're Christian. See, look, we got Jesus Christ in our church name. Right. And, hyper preterists, though, they always have considered themselves to be Christians. I mean, they're really making a push for acceptance.
But you don't think that they should be accepted as Christians in that sense?
No, because they deny a fundamental of the faith. Yeah. And the resurrection, I think Hank Hanegraaff used to say this, and I don't like the way Hank Hanegraaff repeats the same things 10,000 times over, Lilliputian world of enormous complexity. Right. But he says the resurrection is the archstone in the cap of Christianity. He says that a gazillion times, but he's right.
He is right.
And he wrote a book called Resurrection, where he really, got into that. Without the resurrection, there is no Christianity. Yeah. People don't get that. That's, Jesus died and rose again to show that he was victorious over our sin. He was, victorious over death and over everything that Adam lost. If we do not do the same, Adam's curse still prevails upon those who are Christ. Yeah. It's completely ridiculous. You might as well just, be a liberal Christian. I'm not talking about politics here, Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. I agree with you. And just as a side note, this is why why I did the very first episode I did of my podcast, which is that, this is a personal note, and I hope that none of my listeners are offended by this, but it drives me absolutely batty when people talk about their, they can't wait to go to heaven. Glenn Peoples' view aside, physicalism, the fact of the matter is, as you pointed out, our hope is not in what we typically think of when we say, going to heaven. It's in the resurrection. And it saddens me, and I don't know if you get this impression as well, but outside of, thinking Christians, and I don't mean that in a superior way, but just people who are wrapped up in intellectually examining our faith. When you look at just the general Christian populace, it seems like people have forgotten about the resurrection entirely.
Yeah. And they've forgotten, most of them are functional Unitarians as well. Yeah. They don't understand the Trinity. They don't worship the Trinity as Trinity. So yeah, I think the word you were reaching for was more academic.
There you go. Thank you. Yeah. I didn't want to come across as...
Cause you didn't want to, it wasn't pejorative. It was, Yeah. I mean, even in some worship songs that I like, but you got, I'll Fly Away,
Yeah.
that's,
Right.
That isn't our hope at all. Our hope is the resurrection. Paul described, and I don't agree with Glenn Peoples' physicalism, and now that I've studied more, I even less agree with his physicalism. But Paul talked about the state of being unclothed from the body as something that's not desirable. Being with the presence of Christ is desirable, but you're not a full human being until you have your resurrected body.
Right. Whether Glenn is right or not, if there is a disembodied existence in heaven, it's subhuman. It's not what we're meant to be.
Right. And I think in some ways, and I'm sure the hyper-preterists are going to jump all over me for this. I do not mean the same thing that the Adventists mean by it. But when people use terms such as soul sleep, I think there's a nugget of truth there in that J.P. Holding has written about this as well, where he says, in the disembodied state, it's somewhat of a murky existence. We're not fully there because we don't have our bodies. We're not complete.
Yeah.
So in that sense, he describes it as kind of dreamy, murky. And in that way, the soul sleep people have taken it too far. But I can see where the little germ of truth spread into that error.
Sure. Well, and I don't want to, I haven't yet come down off the fence on that. But what I will say is that if I were to view the parable of Lazarus and the rich man as being reflective of the real state of things, and I'm sure that you're familiar with that parable. What Jesus says is that Lazarus was comforted in the bosom of Abraham, and it's interesting because that word "comforted" in the New Testament is always used in the sense of being comforted in the midst of one's suffering. Now, I'm not saying that if we go to heaven when we die, we're in suffering, but what it does suggest is that there's something to be comforted about. We are, like you said, it's dreamy or murky. It's not where we're supposed to be. It's something less than desirable, as you said.
It's a lot of people don't use this word anymore, but I think it's a perfect one. It's inchoate.
I have no idea what that means.
Well, look it up. It's an awesome word. It really is. It's such a useful word that people don't use anymore. It's kind of still used in law, which is why I know it. Believe me, I'm not a walking dictionary or anything of the sort. I can hardly pronounce half the words I use. But it's INCHOATE.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome.
Merriam-Webster defines it as being only partly in existence or operation, imperfectly formed or formulated. Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it.
It's an awesome word, and a lot of times it's used like in talking about pregnancies in the fetus, and the way the organs are being formed and stuff. That it's this system is inchoate, and I just think that's awesome.
Yeah,
anyway,
that is a good word, and I know we've kind of got off on a tangent, but I do want to ask one more question about hyperpreterism. You mentioned that, or you didn't mention, but you've mentioned in your podcast, for example, your episode "Perfuming the Hog," that these people insist that they are the only true or consistent preterists, willing at most to allow us to call ourselves partial preterists, since we only go so far as to say that many prophecies, but not all, were fulfilled in the first century. And as you and I have pointed out, most Christians who have any familiarity with preterism at all refer to these two views as full preterism and partial preterism. The question I have for you is, do you think that these are how Christians should refer to these views?
Absolutely not. And it's important. Some people go, why? You just, it's a war over words. It's semantics. No, it's not. Terminology has to have a ground point. So if the ground point is Christianity, then you have to look at how the view relates to Christianity. To say that you believe the resurrection is future doesn't make you a partial preterist. It makes you a Christian, because all Christians believe the resurrection is future. So you can't use that's a starting assumption. So we're preterist in relation to the things that Christians can disagree on.
Right.
So to say we're partial preterists as opposed to a full preterist, another word for that is a non-Christian. They're not a Christian. So there's no point in making it seem like we're partially something when we're fully Christian.
Yeah.
It's a very, very important thing to do. And I hate when even futurists do this, where they say, well, we're all preterists to some point because, we believe that Jesus Christ already come. No, that just means you're Christian.
Right.
You can't be so equivocal with your terminology because it divests it of all meaning.
Yeah. And, I think that it's not just as you've described it. It's not just for the reasons you've given that I think it's important. It's also because of what it does to the debate. And what I mean by that is so many people that are familiar with preterism and think of it in terms of full preterism and partial preterism will oftentimes not even give our view a fair shake simply by virtue of the fact that they connect it with hyperpreterism. And on the other hand, on the flip side of the coin, and I think it's even worse, hyperpreterism, they do get a fair shake because they have co-opted a word that has a historic, good meaning. And so what you end up having is you have our view denigrated and not even considered because it's connected with hyperpreterism, and you have hyperpreterism given a level of legitimacy it doesn't deserve because it's connected with what is historically a Christian word.
And we don't do this with other points of view. We don't call Calvinists, partial Calvinists and full Calvinists. You got Calvinists and hyper Calvinists.
Right.
And I think the parallel's pretty good.
Yeah.
The hyper Calvinists take things way out of the ballpark,
Yeah. Well, so there are a couple more objections I want to bring up to our view, though. Let's move back out of hyperpreterism. I mentioned earlier that many object to preterism on the grounds that it spiritualizes away the prophecies we've been looking at. But another objection that I've seen made is that preterism leads to hyperpreterism. So, for example, Thomas Eisen, that book I mentioned earlier where he debates Kenneth Gentry, he wrote, "It seems that many preterists are becoming hyperpreterists. Dr. Gentry's moderate preterism may satisfy him and others that they have a systematic answer to dispensational futurism, but it opens the door for too many to move into the heretical position of hyperpreterism. Once one partakes of the preterist approach, it seems hard to stop its growth and resist its appeal to preterize all Bible prophecy." And I've actually heard John MacArthur make similar claims. How would you respond to this charge that that preterism is like a gateway drug, leading to the heresy of hyperpreterism?
The fact is that hyperpreterists are relatively few. They're just very vocal and very obsessed. And again, I would draw another parallel. Does Calvinism lead to hyper-Calvinism? Some hyper-Calvinists will say so, and they're really obsessive and loud, but very small group.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people who hold the preterist view, and only a small amount apostatize. So, and I think you could probably find similarities in any view you go to. I'm just not as educated in other things, but I'm sure, you get somebody, I've heard people say that Trinitarianism leads to polytheism.
Yeah.
You can do that with almost anything. There are going to be people who nut up and take it too far.
Yeah.
And also some people who are preterists haven't really developed a good defense for why they still think certain things are future.
A certain name comes to mind that you've talked about a few times.
Like Gary DeMar?
Like Gary DeMar, right, exactly.
Yeah, he really frustrates me.
Yeah, well, I'll point my listeners to your podcast for that.
Episode 8. Parts 1, 2, and 3, and I'm doing another one soon.
Well, I look forward to that. Gary Quite Contrary, is that what that series was?
Yeah, How Does Your Garden Grow?
Right.
And there's something about Gary.
I loved it. Here's another objection, though. Yeah, I agree. We shouldn't dismiss claims just because of the extreme that some people take them. I mean, that's obvious. Now, both hyperpreterists and futurists will often object to our view on the basis that Jesus promised to come only once, contrary to our claim that he came in a couple of different senses in the first century, while at the same time looking forward to his second coming in our future. How do you respond to hyperpreterists and futurists who would insist that there can only be one sense in which Jesus would come again?
Well, again, we can point to that passage in Revelation where he said he's going to come quickly and show them what's for. If he doesn't come in certain ways, different ways, then I guess, it's exhausted back then.
Yeah.
I mean, all Christians believe that Jesus comes in different ways. They all do. You have to.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I have an article. I was trying to pull it up while we were talking, but I have a bird on my shoulder right now. I don't want to have an eyeball pecked out.
Sure.
I have an article called Dumb and Dumber because I think that's one of the dumbest arguments. I really do. And I apologize to anyone who thinks it's good. Once you read the article, I think you'll do a face slap because really when somebody points out to you, it's really, really bad argument. And it is on my site, and we can probably, do a link to that. But the short summary of it is, when you've got something that's in a sequence, you got the first coming and the second coming. They're like in kind. And that's why the second coming, we believe it's physical, because the first coming was physical. I prefer to use the word Advent, because Advent specifically means physical. While coming is equivocal. It can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah. So
we don't believe in many comings of Christ as in many advents of Christ. We believe in different kinds of comings, but they're different. It's a totally different meaning. Yeah, Jesus promised he'd only be on earth physically twice. We believe that.
Yeah.
But he judges continuously.
Yeah.
He said to the high priest that you'd see the Son of Man, sitting at the right hand of power, which is a position of judgment.
And he said it would happen from now on.
From now on, from this point forward.
Yeah.
You'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and sitting at the right hand of glory, or of the Father, depending on the translation. I love to ask futurists, how can he be sitting and coming at the same time? Is he flying down in a chair?
Right.
When they say he's going to come back in the same way he left, yes, we agree with that. But if you're going to literalize Revelation, he didn't rise riding a white horse. Is he going to be coming back, on a horse? There's all kinds of problems with that sort of thing. But as far as physical advent, we only believe in two of those, just like all Christians do.
Yeah.
All Christians believe in many types of comings. It's dumb. It's shallow.
Yeah, and I will also, I'll include a link to that in my show notes. I'll also include one that I wrote. It was actually my first contribution to the Preterist blog, where I address a Greek grammatical claim that they make as far as there being only one coming, but we'll save that for another time. But there is one more objection, really briefly, I want to look at before we start to begin to wrap this up. And it's raised by a guy named Henry Alford back in 1872. Although I've seen this objection raised by other people as well. But what he wrote was, the preterist view found no favor and was hardly so much as thought of in the time of primitive Christianity. This view is said to have been first promulgated in anything like completeness by the Jesuit Alcazar in 1614. Now, as you've often said, and this is something I agree with, theological novelty isn't a good thing. So the question I have is preterism, relatively speaking, a theological novelty?
On that issue, systemized eschatology itself is, I wouldn't say a novelty, but it is something that has developed over time. The early Christians were concerned with the basics, such as the resurrection, the fact that Christ is coming again, the fact that there'll be a final judgment, the fact that there will be an end of evil and a consummation of the world. That sort of thing is what preoccupied their attention. There were wildly divergent views on the millennium. A lot of the early church was premillennial, but not all of them. None of them had anything remotely close to dispensationalism. If we're really going to talk about theological novelty, you'd point more to dispensational futurism, which is the result of, visions of that, I can't remember, was it Mary something, back at the Plymouth Brethren. That's where the theory of the rapture came up. There's nothing of that at all. Now, preteristic strands and futuristic strands are found throughout church history. But I think James White, as said before too, he doesn't claim any of the early church fathers were Reformed Baptist. Some of them held points of view that were compatible. Some of them were wrong in other areas, but there's a continuous line, of development building upon the foundation. The father of church history, Eusebius, had made some very strong preteristic statements, and that's what Alcazar built upon. Alcazar was the first systemizer of all the various strands. The funny thing is, Alford, he bears forward some of these strands. I think your citation was from the New Testament for English readers, which Henry Alford's quoted from a lot. I guess it's somewhat of an important book. I haven't read it cover to cover. I refer to him several times in my commentary. For instance, the phrase in Matthew 24, it says, "He who endures to the end will be saved." A lot of people have a lot of problem with that in a preteristic context, but Henry Alford supports a preteristic interpretation of that. He said the primary meaning of this seems to be that whoever remained faithful till the destruction of Jerusalem should be preserved from it. No Christian that we know of perished in the siege after it. Those sorts of things have been said all along.
Yeah.
Alcazar may have systemized it, but putting something logically coherent together isn't a theological novelty. Now, I got to be careful in how I say that, because what the hyperpreterists do is they isolated statements that ripped out of the fabric of what the person who said the statement believed could look like. They're hyperpreterists, and they say, well, we're just taking these various comments. No, because when we're taking a strand from somebody, or we're not completely ripping it out of the context in which they believed it and would promulgate something that they would think, absolutely denied the Christian faith.
Right.
It's not cherry picking. There's a difference. Henry Alford also is very interested in Henry Alford supports the view, and this is even more controversial, which talks about the heavens and earth will pass away in Matthew 24. I'm going to quote from myself, because paraphrasing it is just not going to work. So I'm in my commentary talking about this.
Okay.
And I said, Old Covenant Israel was a quote unquote heaven and earth that was done away with. But we also know that the entire creation, of which earthly kingdoms are only microcosms, will also be done away with and will be put in actuality under Christ. And I quote 1 Corinthians 15. I said, so yes, it happened, yes, it is happening, and yes, it will happen. Also note that in the establishment of Zion, which the New Testament teaches us has been fulfilled and is being fulfilled and will be fulfilled in the church, Isaiah speaks of it as God planting the heavens and laying the foundations of the earth as a new creation. Many respected commentators make this type of application, such as Henry Alford.
Yeah.
So he's saying something right, but putting a spin on it that's wrong.
Or at the very least, the people that might cite him are using what he's saying out of context to say that preterism is something brand new. When in fact,
like he would have opposed all of, and he wouldn't. There's a lot of very preterist-friendly comments from him. That's why I got the book.
Yeah. And just in case anybody missed it, I think that what you're saying, and I would agree with this, is that it's not just a systematic preterism that has developed over time. It's a systematic anything eschatological, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even there's a paper that is cited a lot, and I actually got a copy of it, and it's called something to the effect of it was a thesis paper done at Dallas Theological Seminary, written by a premillennialist called The Premillennialism of the Early Church Fathers, and he even demonstrates that the early church fathers had no systemized eschatology. Even those that were premillennial contradicted themselves constantly and confessed that they didn't understand how the two things came together.
Yeah.
And the reason that they contradicted themselves is they felt they had to be faithful to both passages and didn't yet know how to resolve it.
Yeah.
So on those types of issues, there was flux.
Yeah.
And I still think on some things there still is a little bit of flux, but not in the foundations, not on the very contours of salvation history.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, that leads me into the final few questions that I've got for you, and it's no longer objections. I think that we've addressed all the major ones pretty easily. But there is something that I'll confess is kind of near and dear to my heart, which makes me sort of an enigma, I think, amongst preterism. And the question is this. I've known Christians and I've heard of others who think that preterists tend to have a very low opinion of the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. But I've heard you make a very compelling case in your podcast and in your appearances on other programs that it is actually a dispensational understanding of eschatology which, if consistently followed, casts the modern people of Israel in a negative light, whereas preterism does not. Can you explain that?
Well, if you're, like I said earlier, if you take the race interpretation, your interpretation will then make Jews of all times still being punished for and being guilty of the sins of the first century. But also, in a dispensationalist view, what Hitler did is nothing compared to what's going to happen in Israel. And they're not necessarily looking forward to a bunch of Jews dying, but they're looking forward to that as part of the second coming. And they're paying to have, because they think that, a lot of Jewish people have to be in Israel. They got that ministry on Wings of Eagles that pays, to send like maybe Jews from Russia into Israel. Why? Why would you do that? Why would you send somebody to some place that you think where 2/3 of them are going to die?
Yeah.
It'd be like sending, right before, Hitler came to power, sending a bunch of Jewish people to Germany. Why would you do that?
Right.
It's crazy. I don't view a future and look forward to a future in which 2/3 of Jewish people living in Israel are going to die.
Yeah.
I just don't. If the Bible really said it, I would believe it. Wouldn't be too happy about it.
Right.
But, and then people say, well, you don't think there's any glorious future for the Jewish people. That's wrong, because I'm a post-millennialist and I think the gospel is going to be victorious. The thing is that I don't only think there's going to be a glorious future for Jewish people, but also for Italians and Indians and, Eskimos. So.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry. No, that's good. You go.
No, that's all right. Well, so that leads me to my next question. And whatever your answer to this is okay. I'll elaborate after you answer, but, many futurists, particularly dispensationalists, see the Jewish people and the nation of Israel as being the focus of end times prophecy, as being the specific subject of prophecies yet to be fulfilled. And we agree that Israel was the focus of much of end times prophecy, but that it was that first century generation of unbelieving Jews who were being judged, and not some Jews some 2,000 years removed. But what does this mean for the people and nation of Israel today? Is, besides just being part of the glorious success of the church, in your post-millennialist view, which I don't share, but that's okay. What does this mean for them? Is there any place for Israel specifically, apart from the Gentile church in biblical prophecy yet to be fulfilled, in your view?
Here, short answer, no.
Okay.
But I want to correct some terminology. I don't call us a Gentile church. I think we were grafted into the olive tree of Israel, and when God, in the New Testament refers to the Israel of God, I think that's the church. So, we've been grafted in. As I said, I don't believe Judaism has existed since the first century. Christianity, we're just talking terminologies, that's the continuation of the Old Testament faith. We just call it Christianity now, but if I want to be more specific, we believe in a Jewish Messiah that brought in the Jewish age. We believe in a Jewish faith. We don't call it that. It might seem awkward now, but that is the implications of the New Testament.
Yes.
The new covenant was only promised to be given to the house of Judah and the house of Israel. If you're not a member of the house of Judah and the house of Israel, you have no promise of the new covenant. And that's another thing that dispensationalists don't get a grip on.
Sure. Yeah, I would agree. But so what you're saying though is that as far as Israel as a nation or as an ethnic people group, there's nothing specifically yet to be fulfilled for them apart from the church. Is that what?
Well, let me tell you where there's one thing where I'd say maybe, because now you're wording it a little bit differently.
Fair enough.
The nation of Israel, like the physical country over in the Middle East, they're antichrist. They deny Christ. They prevent people from giving the gospel. They're completely secular. It's not. It's nothing that would be pleasing to God. So I don't think there's a future for the nation of Israel in that way. When it comes down to individual ethnic Jews, as I said, there's a difference between being ethnically Jewish and being religiously Jewish. I don't think religious Jews exist anymore.
Agreed.
Unless they're Christians.
Right.
But maybe, I'm not sure. There might be. God, he set aside Israel in the Old Testament for a reason. There are some verses that seem to think that make me think, especially if Calvinism true and he elects people based upon his own good pleasure, perhaps there is a massive election of ethnic Jewish people to come in the future. I don't know. It could be. But not focus on the actual nation of Israel over there. Okay.
Well, I appreciate you leaving open that window because I think most preterists agree with you, but there's a certain extent to which I don't agree with you, and that's okay. I do think there's a specific place in prophecy for Israel, but, the question I just wanted to find out was if you thought that there was anything in a systematic preterism that demands that there are no prophecies whatsoever that remain to be fulfilled specifically by Israel's future? And I mean, might there be room within a preteristic eschatology for a specific role for Israel?
It depends on, again, how I answered your question two different ways depending upon how it was worded. So it depends on how you define Israel.
Sure.
As a geopolitical nation, no.
Well,
I don't think, again, I hate to say that. I don't think so. Maybe other people, they see things a little bit differently. I'm not the end all and be all final word on what's consistent with preterism. I don't think so.
Okay.
But you disagree. You're wrong. You're on Windows, so, we can't all be perfect.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. I operate a Windows machine. That's good. I mean, the reason I was asking is because there are many Christians, and I'm thinking primarily of Jewish Christians, including friends of mine and friends of their friends, who might reject preterism out of hand because they've been told that there's no room for Israel in prophecy as a nation and as an ethnic people. Now, I think that we would agree that what one presupposes or desires as far as Israel is concerned is not a valid reason to reject our view. So I agree with that. But I just wanted my listeners to know that preterism isn't monolithic on this point. Even if most preterists would share your understanding, I will just say for my listeners, I do think that there's room, maybe I'll talk about it with you in email, in the future, for Israel as a people group and as a nation, eschatologically speaking. But the point just being that systematically, preterism doesn't require that there be no such, at least in my opinion, fulfillment on the part of specifically Israel.
Again, depending on how you define it, Kenneth Gentry would say that he has a tape series of prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled, and he talks about mass conversion of the Jewish people. But not the nation of Israel, not as a geopolitical nation, but as ethnic people group.
Okay, no, so
it might not all be in one place, scattered across the world, but the way they'll be converted is to come into the church. They're not going to be converted in this dispensational way of where they're going to have a temple again.
Yes.
And stuff like that.
I'm glad you clarified because, so it sounds like you would be open to the possibility that ethnically Jewish people, like you said, could experience a mass conversion. And you said it might not be centralized, but could it be centralized within the nation of Israel, even though the nation of Israel may not have anything to do with it?
Well, there might be, just because there's a lot of ethnically Jewish people there.
Right. Yeah.
But actually, I think there's more ethnically Jewish people in the city of New York than is in all of Israel. I read that somewhere, statistic. So, I mean, if there's going to be a mass conversion of Jews, it's going to be where Jewish people are. There's going to be a lot. Yeah. So, yeah, there would be a lot in Israel, and maybe then they would reform the nation.
Fair enough.
And make it not so secular and don't outlaw the spreading of the gospel. But I also believe there's going to be a mass conversion of all people groups.
Yes.
But Kenneth Gentry believes that the New Testament, specifically not only talks about the conversion of other people groups, singles out Israel as well. Israel meaning ethnically Jewish people.
Well, like I said, I'm very glad you brought that up because that's exactly what I feel as well. So I'm glad to know that I'm not just open to that. I think that's exactly what the New Testament teaches, and I'm glad to know that as a preterist, I'm not alone.
No, I think a lot of, I think what happens is you hear a term and somebody's using it a different way. That term Israel is so equivocal that I think you have to go through a lot of definitions on exactly what you mean.
I would agree, and actually I'm doing a series. I've got one on my podcast with a friend of mine where we're tackling just those kind of issues. But anyway, that's the topic of another discussion. So let's wrap this up then. I know that many Christians, and I know many Christians, and I know many others who, for a variety of reasons, don't think that this study of eschatology is important. I'm sure that you've heard this phrase, which makes me sick, but apparently
pan-millennial.
Yeah, exactly, or pan-tribulational, or whatever. Right, exactly. Try to swallow that throw up back. But as preterists, we're not pan-tribulational at all, or pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib. But I think that line. That phrase is reflective of an attitude shared by many Christians, one which dismisses as a serious study of what the Bible has to say about the future as being unimportant. If you think that it's an important question worth examining, why? Why should Christians invest time and energy in studying eschatology?
Many reasons. Because eschatology is bound up with Christology, and Christology is certainly worthy of study. Eschatology teaches us what Christ came to do and fulfill. I mean, what can be more important than that? And I think it's been estimated, again, I'm quoting somebody, I haven't done the statistics myself, that 30% of the Bible is prophecy.
Yeah.
I don't think you could dismiss that large of a chunk. It's not a minor issue. It's bound up in all other doctrines. A little earlier when we were talking about the Jewish people, and then I brought in the fact that, now I'm holding to a Calvinistic belief and how that fit in.
Yeah.
And, in what Christ actually came to do. The nature of his victory, it's not at all an issue.
Yeah.
And Christ spoke about it quite a bit. I mean, there's that whole chapter,
That's right. That's right. An entire chapter. Yeah.
You can't dismiss it. Now you could admit, well, maybe that's not your area of interest. You're having difficulty understanding God's place else, but I don't think you can be so cavalier as many Christians are about it.
I would agree, and I would just point to the turmoil that you went through, for example, as evidence that if we aren't at least on a fundamental level grounded in eschatology, we're leaving ourselves very open to being led astray by not just hyper-preterists, but potentially other groups as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's eschatology or eschatological issues are part of almost every ecumenical creed. The Apostles' Creed mentions eschatology, and that's one that, that's all churches agree with that. Even the Roman Catholic Church will hold to the Apostles' Creed. Of course, we would have a little bit of a different interpretation of one section of it, but the rest of it, it talks about eschatology as being an essential of the faith.
Yeah, that's right. Well, okay, so here, let me leave my listeners with what I hope they take away from this. Bringing this full circle back to the issue of skepticism, I think they've got a legitimate beef. Jesus and his apostles did very clearly, I think, say that much of what Christians think remains to be seen in our future was to take place within the lifetimes of their contemporaries. Our interpretation, a preteristic interpretation of end times prophecy, not only serves as powerful proof that Jesus was a genuine prophet of unparalleled accuracy, but that, and thus that the skeptics are wrong, but it also understands prophecy in what I think is a much more biblically consistent way, and in its correct cultural context. And then, of course, I don't think that preterists are forced to become heretics. We can be consistent and yet legitimately affirm the end times essentials of the Christian faith. Now, we could talk about this for hours and hours, but what would you like to leave my listeners with? Is there something that you'd like them to take away from all this?
Yeah, buy a Mac.
Yeah, there you go.
I had to.
I know.
What I would leave them with is not to be cavalier, and to find some place in their study, if they're serious about studying the Bible, for eschatology, and to realize that the popular view isn't the only view, and it's not even historically a majority view. And also, with the views maybe you disagree with, you have studied it and you disagree with, to at least understand what other people are saying.
Yeah.
A lot of people just automatically, will just dismiss the preterist view before ever really taking the time to understand why we think what we think. Most people are not so stupid that they walk into walls face first. Usually if they believe something that seems to us on the face ridiculous, it's usually us who have the problem and not them, because generally normal people have a reason for believing something. It's not just this sheer, crazy, ridiculous thing.
Right.
I mean, even though they're wrong and we can prove them wrong, Jehovah's Witnesses have a reason why they believe the way they believe. They have certain verses they point to, and we have to be able to deal with them and not be set up straw men. We have to understand where they're coming from. And the way futurists, interact with preterists a lot of the time, especially on forums like Theology, I think it's just shameful. They refuse to understand where the preterist is coming from to accurately represent them, and it seems like some futurists would rather commit hara-kiri than admit a preterist has a point.
Yeah.
Even if you say like me, okay, in isolation I can see that, but this is why I don't agree. I find that actually in all issues in Christians, or some people are so entrenched that to actually admit that someone else has made a good point, they would rather commit ritual suicide.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. Glenn expressed a similar sentiment after our interview as well, and I agree. Well, now this has gone on, I think, a lot longer than I had anticipated, but what I tried to do was give sort of an introductory primer to preterism to my listeners. If they want to learn more, what resources can you recommend as far as books and websites, whatever? What resources can you recommend?
Well, I hate to plug my own site, but it's not all my own work. It might be my site, but very little on the Preterist site. I'm not talking about the Preterist blog. I'm talking the Preterist site is an index of all kinds of good works. And some of them are free and online, clickable links. Others will be lists of books that you can get, and a lot of them are used on Amazon for inexpensive. So I would really refer somebody over to the Preterist site to take a look through the indexes. And because it's free and because I've done a lot of research and you can look in the endnotes to see where I got stuff from, I would point people to my commentary on Matthew 24. I'm sure it's got its faults, but it will give you a good background on where the view's coming from, and then you'll see what scholars I was relying upon, and then you could go to those particular works. And, particularly because it's online and free, I think it's a good place to start, some of those online free articles.
And where can they find the Preterist site and the Preterist blog and the Preterist podcast, for that matter?
Well, the Preterist site, I kind of went for a theme. Yeah. So we got preteristsite.com, preteristblog.com, preteristpodcast.com.
There you go.
So it's and I even have I've got preterist email at gmail.com.
Nice.
Yeah. So yeah, that's where you'd go, to either of those three sites. The Preterist blog is also good if you want but it's more contemporary issues. It kind of presupposes you have a good working background knowledge of what's going on. Sure. And
I also, because I contribute to that blog, will point my listeners there as a good place to go. Okay, well this has been really good. I really appreciate the time that you've taken with me. Just thanks so much, Dee Dee.
Hey, no problem at all.
If you're listening and are new to preterism, or actually, I guess even if you're already very familiar with preterism, you've no doubt got a bunch of questions, and that's totally okay. I intended this only as an introduction to preterism, and I think the interview served that end well. I'll talk about preterism in greater depth in future episodes, so please do send me your feedback, your questions, and I'll try and address those in one of those future episodes. In the meantime, thanks so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode of the Theapologetics Podcast. Until then...